With Metroid Dread just around the corner, I had one more box to check in preparation of the first new 2D Metroid game in almost 20 years, the Game Boy Advance classic, Metroid Fusion. Metroid Fusion, or Metroid 4, takes place in the Biologic Space Laboratories, a space station lab run by the Galactic Federation. On a mission set up in the opening cutscene, Samus is acting as a bodyguard to the researchers and is infected by a new threat in this game, the X-Parasite. This X-Parasite goes on to mimic Samus herself, dubbed the SA-X, becoming a serious threat that you have to handle. I was very excited to take on the penultimate game of the 2D Metroid story, and I hope this video will convince you to check it out, or maybe just get you a little more excited for Metroid Dread. Metroid games are known for their environmental storytelling. Most of the time, it's just Samus and the explorable territories around her, with the story being peppered in through visual cues in the changing environment. Fusion, however, is a lot more upfront with its story. Not only is there a somewhat lengthy opening cutscene, but also Samus is often communicating directly with her new AI assistant, Adam, which she names after her former commanding officer, Adam Malkovich. This AI points you to your next objective throughout the game, while giving some context to what's going on around you from navigation rooms spread out throughout the laboratories. It made me feel less isolated, which I thought had its pros and cons. The easy cons are that it oftentimes took away some of the sense of adventure that other Metroid games can offer, since I always knew where to head next. There were twists along the way that kept me on my toes for sure, but I still had that blinking icon on my map to let me know I was heading in the right way. I did think the constant communication made the story a little easier to take in, since all the events around me are being explained in more detail than just me happening to notice the changing environment, such as how I took in the story in Super Metroid. How you feel about this will probably just come down to personal preference. I personally think both ways can be effective, and Fusion doesn't change my mind here. A Metroid game's map is one of the most important parts of the game in my opinion. A well-designed map should reward the player for using all of their skills and abilities to find the path forward, or just to find some fun secrets and upgrades. No surprise here, I think Metroid Fusion does very well with this idea. The constant drip feed of new ways to bend the environment around me through traversal upgrades and new weapon abilities felt as satisfying as ever, and made going back to these old areas lots of fun when I happened to remember an area I couldn't reach and go back to find an energy tank or a missile upgrade. However, Fusion's map has one slightly negative aspect I thought was noticeable, and that was the more linear progression than previous games. While the map itself is sprawling, up, down, left, and right, and constantly surprising you with new ways to challenge your skills, there was really only ever one way to progress, and like I mentioned earlier, it was pretty much always marked on the map to head that way. This kept the pacing up, sure, because I rarely ever got lost, but it also took a little bit of the wonder of exploring the environment, since on the first pass through an area, all the paths but one seemed to be just out of reach. Don't get me wrong, it was still well done, and if you aren't paying close attention, it'll feel like you're making these discoveries on your own, but really it's almost like you're being funneled towards the goal rather than making your own path. A sense of isolation is commonplace in Metroid games. You versus all threats in your path to accomplish Samus' goal. Historically, Samus is made out to be able to handle anything in her path. She is a true badass. Fusion flips this thought on its head, telling you repeatedly that the SA-X on board with you is to be feared and avoided. It is Samus at her full power, while you are just constantly playing catch-up, trying to get all your powers and abilities back. This always made going into the new area feel intense, not knowing if I'll have to run or fight the SA-X, or if he was even in the same area as me at all. This sense of dread, if you will, always kept me on edge and made the encounters with the SA-X that much more memorable and terrifying. Even when you don't see the SA-X though, you know when it's around, whether that's from the sound of its footsteps or the frequently destroyed environment around you where it has been. Samus is an intergalactic bounty hunter, and what is an intergalactic bounty hunter without cool alien monsters to defeat? Metroid Fusion has more bosses than any other 2D Metroid before it, and like previous games, they are well varied in design and rewarding to defeat. I love seeing the boss color palettes change from their base color to yellow and then red, getting more intense along the way, and think this idea is a great visual indicator to how much you have left in front of you without just having a boss health bar. Due to the limitations of the game design, however, I often found myself just spamming rockets to win, and whether or not this was the intention of the boss design, it pretty much always worked. Also, while I felt all the bosses felt special and were interesting set pieces, some of the later ones felt a little unfair at times, taking huge chunks of health at a time from hard to avoid attacks, forcing me to fall into very safe and sometimes boring loops of repetitive actions to take the boss down. These later bosses often had strangely punishing setbacks too, with save rooms being a couple minutes run away, which can get very frustrating to repeat if the boss takes more than 1 or 2 tries. This wasn't always a problem, as most bosses had a save room just next door, but the ones that didn't were very noticeable. Each boss ends with Samus getting a new part of her suit back, which always felt good and worthwhile, helping make the areas you just went through to get to the boss feel more open if it was a traversal upgrade, or less threatening if it was a weapon upgrade. One of my favorite parts of the Metroid games, or really any games for that matter, is character progression. Seeing my once weak character become a weapon of mass destruction before my eyes is always a treat, and Fusion gives me just what I want here. This is nothing new to the Metroid series. They typically start with Samus losing all of her powers and abilities from the previous game through some terrible event that nearly takes her out, and Fusion doesn't stray from this. One interesting part about Fusion, though, is Samus loses her suit itself and has to deal with a much more vulnerable one. Well, at least that's what the game is telling you anyway. It just feels like a starter suit from any Metroid game. I didn't really feel like I was actually made of paper like the game wants you to feel, barring a few tough boss fights. So this is just par for the course. As usual, the weapon upgrades felt fun to unlock, going from its weak single beam to a much more devastating options I won't directly spoil here, but if you played other games in the series, you probably know what to expect. By the end of the game, I was confidently running through old areas, obliterating once tough enemies without much thought at all. Old platforming sections that could feel difficult or tedious were now easily crossed with no fear of having to space out jumps properly or climb the same boring ladders. The game wasn't super original with the powers, with all the old classics and not much else, but it felt good as expected and was still satisfying to see. One downside to the upgrade paths is getting them always felt pretty predictable. I don't really think there are any missable or super secret upgrades. All of them either came directly from a boss or from a waypoint in the map you were sent directly to. Fusion is another quality demonstration of well thought out map design, character progression, and eerie, sometimes heart-racing environmental storytelling. The more direct story does its part to pull you along if you aren't a fan of the way Metroid games normally feed you, but I don't think it was too invasive for those who like Metroid games for their isolation. I mean, you really are just talking with an AI, which is almost more isolating and creepy when you think about it. The environments were well done, with beautiful sprite work that was always fun to explore when given the chance. Bosses felt frequent, but still meaningful, and the character progression was as cathartic as always. Most importantly though, it was just fun to be Samus, and it more than got me ready to see what comes next when Dread releases just ahead. Have you played Metroid Fusion? Are you excited for Metroid Dread? Let me know down in the comments, and while you're down there, consider leaving me a like or even subscribing if you're feeling particularly kind. I try to review a game every few weeks, and I plan on doing Metroid Dread next, which is very exciting to me. I haven't been too active on the streaming side as of late, but I plan to get back on the horse soon to get some more Smash Bros time in and have some other cool ideas planned as well. I'll be streaming on Twitch and here on YouTube going forward, so maybe come say hi if you actually made it this far in the video. Thanks again for watching, and see you next mission with Metroid Dread.